Welcome, this is Dr. Rhoades. Here we're going to discuss elder abuse and what to do when you suspect it as a financial advisor. How big of a problem is it? Well, it's everywhere. There are an estimated 5 million Americans aged 60 and older who experience some form of neglect or abuse every year. And here in the state of Kentucky, they launched over 2,000 investigations just back in 2018. And, of course, there's many unreported cases of elder abuse. What about this case? Poor the bear, he's been abused by his wife. What do you do? Well, you have to kind of investigate what was the source of the abuse. In this case, it was failure to furnish an adequate supply of chocolate chip cookies. Perhaps not something worthy of reporting to authorities. So there are several laws that apply at both the state and federal levels. There's a general elder abuse statute that basically requires everyone in the state of Kentucky, regardless of who they are, if they see elder abuse happen, they need to report it to the elder abuse hotline. And there's also a model act that has been adopted here in Kentucky that governs state investment advisors. Investment advisors are either regulated at the federal level or the state level, depending on the size of their firm. And a lot of state investment advisors, those are registered at the state level, would be subject to this act. In fact, all federal advisors who are resident in Kentucky or do practice in Kentucky are also subject to the Kentucky State Investment Advisor statute. Then we have some federal rules and laws. Rule 2165 applies to broker-dealer firms, those who basically sell securities like sell mutual funds on a commission basis or for 12b1 fees, and their employees who are called registered representatives. And we have something relatively new called the Senior Safe Act of 2018. So let's explore these. The state law basically says any person, including but not limited to physician, law enforcement officer, nurse, social worker, cabinet personnel, coroner, medical examiner, or caretaker. Uh, Basically, and it's much more broader than that. It's basically any person whatsoever, if you have a reasonable cause to suspect that an adult has suffered abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be an elderly person, someone over the age of 60 or so. All right. We also have this FINRA's regulation. FINRA is the self-regulatory organization for broker-dealers that basically allows brokers to place a temporary hold on disbursements of funds or securities. So if somebody calls up and says, I want $10,000 or $100,000, or I want all of my stock in this company or this shares of this mutual fund to be transferred to somebody else, then you can put a temporary hold on that if you believe that reasonably believe that financial exploitation might be involved. Yeah. So that's a temporary hold. It doesn't apply to transactions. So if somebody calls up and they say, just sell my stock, you still have to do that. What's interesting about that is it's kind of a loophole because a lot of people have checks that they can write on their brokerage account. So somebody might call up and say, sell all of my shares of stock, and you might say, what are you going to do with the cash? And then somebody says, well, I'm thinking about what to do with it, and they won't tell you. um, that might lead you to make some more inquiries with the customer at that point, but you can't refuse the order to buy or sell securities. um, Again, if you do believe this financial exploitation, you can um, not only put a temporary hold on any transfers out of the account, including cash, but you can also do that if a state agency requests you to do that. You don't even have to wait for any type of formal order or a letter. You just need to document that. There's also that state act that applies to investment advisors and to broker dealers as a result. Basically, it says that uh, everyone has to notify Adult Protective Services and the Commissioner of Securities, which has a different name in each jurisdiction. It might be commissioner, it might be the head of the division or something like that. All right. And may notify any third party previously designated by the eligible adult. So all investment advisors basically do this, and most brokerage firms do this. They basically ask their clients, if we believe that you are ever subject to financial exploitation, or if we believe that your incapacity has been diminished, who can we contact? Give us basically advance consent to contact one or more trusted family members, and I always ask for more than one family member if I can, if there are such, because you never know if somebody who might be trusted turns out to be the exploiter, and you would like to be able to contact somebody else in the family. And of course, you can delay disbursements just like the federal regulation does. So, what should you do? Well, you ought to, whenever you see financial exploitation, you ought to report it to the state securities regulation and to Adult Protective Services, and also check to make sure that your report with Adult Protective Services is going to be forwarded to law enforcement. A lot of these cases can be the subject of criminal action. There are criminal laws that basically people will violate if they commit financial exploitation of the elderly. And if your report is not going to be forwarded to local law enforcement, then you could file that report yourself. What you want to do is get as many people working on this as possible. You can also and should file what's called an SAR report, Suspicious Activities Report. Basically, these reports came around into existence about 15, 20 years ago because of money laundering. It was an anti-money laundering, but basically the purpose of the statute has been expanded to include tax fraud and money, not only money laundering, but also terrorist financing and also financial fraud, which includes elder abuse. So how do you know what to do, and are you doing this correctly? Well, every firm's got a compliance officer, and that compliance officer should be well versed in what to do and probably has procedures on what to do. So when you make a report, however, you just can't rely upon your compliance officer to make the report. Your compliance officer should be with you when making the report, but you, the person who witnessed the financial abuse, is the one who should be making the report. So, another big thing is report each time this is suspected abuse. You might make a report, you might not hear anything about it. State agencies do have some confidentiality rules where they can't tell you what the outcome was. But if you see another suspicious act with the same client, you ought to report that again. Again, the temporary fees on the account, and consider again whether to contact another family member if you have permission to do so. Otherwise, some confidentiality laws might apply. So there's some training sessions that almost every state does for those in financial services, whether it be banking or investment advisors or brokers or even insurance agents. So, and it just an example of one from the state of Indiana, and I'm going to highlight in yellow some things to kind of go over. Of course, they set forth what their mission is at the beginning. They set forth a resource, basically called Senior Safe in their state. All right. And of course, every presentation comes with a disclaimer and has goals, why report, and how to report. So, discussing why report, what they go into what is financial exploitations, and how you play a key role in trying to prevent the bad effects of financial exploitation, what all the benefits to the community and to your client, obviously preserving your client's financial independence, and benefits to your business. And Mickey Rooney testified because he was the subject of financial abuse. He testified it before Congress and basically pointing out that this can happen to anybody. Why address this issue? Well, obviously we have a lot more people becoming older and retired. All right. Uh, it is amazing the number of people who are subject to fraudulent calls, especially the elderly. When I practiced down in Florida, I was amazed at the number of calls that I would receive, and then I go out and ask my clients, and amazing the number of client communications that they would receive. And it's just with the internet, it's just gotten and smartphones and the like, it's just gotten overboard. The number of people who try to commit fraud. So you need to identify these red flags, so to speak. All right, and basically suspicious behavior. All right, and somebody showing an undue degree of fear or anxiety, um, or people who change their relationships with others. All right, somebody you're not able to speak with anymore because you call up and they say he or she's not available, and a sudden appearance of relatives who had not been previously involved is a big red flag. Yeah. So a new caretaker, relative, or friend suddenly begins conducting financial transactions on behalf of the elder, not without proper documentation. Really can't conduct proper financial transactions without proper documentation, but they can certainly influence them. For example, I had a client one time, didn't have a great deal of money in his account, 100,000, 200,000 or so, and every the, we had basically set up so that he would get an automatic um, check from his account. And At the time, we didn't have the bank transfer set up for him. We basically would have him come in and write him a check off of his account every month, and we would trade in his account to raise money for his small disbursement. Well, that occurred on the first of each month, and we started to notice that when he came up in his car, which is a very small little compact car, that he wasn't driving anymore. Instead, there were two young girls. Now, he was like 75 or 80. His wife had passed away 5 years before, something like that. And he was really getting up there in age. And these two young girls were basically driving him. We noticed that after a couple months. And so what I did was I went out with one of my partners to the gentleman's house, and I found out that basically two prostitutes had moved in with him, and uh, and basically taken over his finances. When he would get a Social Security check, which back then checks were deposited by mail, um, they would actually drive him down to the bank and cash his Social Security check. They were involved. The prostitutes were involved with drugs, which is very common. But they had basically taken over his financial life. I actually called up his son, reached out to his son because I was his estate planning attorney as well as a financial advisor, and felt as an attorney I had the authority to do that. And got his son down to Florida, and his son said, "Well, you know what? My father seems happy." Yeah. Well, eventually we got the son to file guardianship on his father's behalf, and the son kind of felt bad about it, which is understandable. About changes to beneficiary designations, you can see somebody say, "I want to change the beneficiary on my IRA account," or something like that. Or you notice that they've changed the beneficiary on their will to trust. One of the things we always like to ask about once a year with our clients is, has been any changes in your estate planning documents? And Go on from there. Other red flags, basically any change in their established financial management habits or patterns of any types. Large withdrawals should be a flag. In a lot of firms, they will actually flag any transaction, any withdrawal over a certain dollar amount, or so many transactions or a certain dollar amount within a period of time, like within a quarter or something like that. So those can be automatically tagged, and a lot of software problems and compliance officers will actually check on those, try to make sure that there's not fraud occurring within the firm or by somebody outside the firm with respect to the client. So, change of addresses, especially when somebody is not really moving, uh, obviously, and setting up new joint accounts, that can happen at times. So, um, what can you do if you face this? Well, you can suggest alternatives to large cash withdrawals and discourage any wire transfers. You can basically say, well, let me set up a monthly amount that's reasonable for you to pay your bills and the like with. Most clients are very receptive to that, but that way you can also track when they need more money. Uh, and make clients aware of the way to limit the risk of joint accounts, which really is very tough to do. When you have a joint account, usually each person has the ability to access that account. So if somebody's saying, I need to support somebody else, you need to basically investigate that. Every firm will have their own requirements and procedures. And remember, a reasonable belief is adequate reporting. You don't need to have proof. So any type of reasonable belief and no dollar amount is too small to report. So, just going on in this presentation, how to report. Um, Basically, you have to consider confidentiality laws that might apply to you. Are you required to make a report by law? And do you need your client's permission? A lot of confidentiality laws out there, both federal and state. Um, and I'll skip over these because we're not really going into the details of them. It is, of course, possible that in addition to making mandatory reports, you can try to meet with the client and refer them to services that might help them. Uh, Probably number one, I'd say, is their estate planning attorney. Estate planning attorneys who specialize in estate planning, especially those who deal with the elderly, are quite used to forming a fairly deep relationship with their clients, a trusting relationship, and also um, are more familiar often with the local resources to bring to bear. But there are some other resources that are available too. Again, suspicious activity reports. Uh, Brokers are subject to filing suspicious activity reports, as are bankers, but right now investment advisors are not. Investment advisors typically don't have custody of the client's securities. That's usually with a discount brokerage firm or an affiliated brokerage firm. Therefore, it has been felt that investment advisors per se are subject to suspicious activity reports, but they can file them. And there, when you file a suspicious activity report, you actually note elder financial exploitation there. Uh, Again, you still have to do local reporting, the state adult protective services as well, and each state has got their own adult protective services. People who have difficulty communicating with you or understanding you, that might be a flash sign. So, for example, maybe this person has difficulty understanding from time to time. Yeah. And moving on, there's a process for that. Some states have really been overburdened in terms of the number of investigators that they have. So be aware it might take some time for these things to be investigated and resolved. You need to repeat the reporting. One of the problems is under state statutes, confidentiality laws, you may not know the outcome of the report that you may have. So if you see this continuing to happen, you keep on filing reports. You can file multiple reports about the same client or customer. Um, and you can make a report to law enforcement because there are some laws out there that basically you could just call up law enforcement and say, here's the situation. Is this a potential violation of the law? Should I be filing a report? If you think somebody's in immediate danger, always call 911. That's for sure. Now, immediate danger to themselves, in terms of physical danger, or danger to another in terms of being exploited, or in terms of physical danger. All right. So, There's some other things that could be going on: identity theft, scams that happen. Uh, Somebody's being subjected to a lottery or sweepstakes scam or some type of grandparent scam. A very common scam nowadays is for grandparents to get a call that basically is from their grandson or granddaughter who's in college, who calls up and says, "I'm in jail. I need bail money wired to this account," or something like that. That's a very common scam nowadays. Yeah. So you can file non-emergency reports and then an emergency report if you think somebody's in immediate danger. So this is just state securities regulator. You'd also need to report there if you're an investment advisor or a broker dealer. In addition to any federal reporting or law enforcement reporting, um, reports to FINRA. Basically, you also report to the state. Now, there are some community-based services out there. In addition to like estate planning attorneys, you can refer to other services with the client's consent. Um, and um, those one is, of course, legal aid services. Now, that's for people who can't afford attorneys typically. Area Agency on Aging has food assistance, transportation service, and respite care for caregivers. All of that might help in certain situations. And we also have domestic violence and sexual assault problems. Now, these actually also occur with the elderly, and even they can even occur in first marriages situations. You would think that most of the time, yes, women are the victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and the like, and there are domestic violence shelters, pretty much one in just about every county that exists. I had a case one time where a gentleman who had been married to his wife for almost 70 years had to be put into a shelter. Not the same shelter with everybody else. They actually rented a hotel room for him. And the problem was that his wife was getting very old, and they didn't have a lot of money. They were retired. He was referred to me as a charity case, and I took him on to basically help him through this bad situation. And um, it turned out that his wife would seize his cane and beat him over the head with it. And he actually had a whole bunch of bruises and some cuts on his head, his bald head, as a result of that. So, and this is just in the state of Indiana, some cases to call. There's SaveOurSeniors.org, which basically has a whole bunch of resources about this on a national basis, including a lot of things from the state securities regulators. Yeah. And every state seems to have their own type of uh, resources as well, maybe some type of central resources. So um, here's one: dozens of organizations to empower Indiana communities to prevent and end exploitation and abuse. Yeah. So that's the Secretary of State's slotted from Indiana. There's similar training available in every state, and most compliance consulting firms will also have training. I looked one up this morning. It was like $120 for a PowerPoint presentation, something like that. Of course, I downloaded Indiana's, which was free. Uh, so let's just review your assignment. There's three case studies that I'd like you to tackle. There's similar answers for the first two of them, actually. The first case is Mr. Sonora, 90 years old, early signs of dementia. He's been able to manage living on his own. His wife died a few years ago. You are the registered representative of a broker dealer firm. You learned that a married couple approached Samuel Sonora and offered to help him. So Mr. Sonora welcomed their assistance, and then all of a sudden you were not able to contact him. And you called the couple to find out where he was. The couple said they didn't know where he was. They reported him missing to police at that time, and 2 days later, Mr. Sonora, poor Samuel, was found at a bus terminal 1,000 miles from his home. He got back, and his then he just called and requested a $100,000 transfer from his account. to his checking account. That is something investment advisors often do, transfer money from their brokerage account of a client over to the checking account. This would require you to sell some securities, probably incur some capital gains tax along the way. What should you do? And what liability might you incur if you don't do anything? Now, this is a broker dealer firm that you're dealing with. You're a registered representative, so you're subject to FINRA rules here. In addition to the federal statute, in addition to the state statute that applies. And the general, there are two state statutes. One is for all securities firms, and the other one is the general calling to adult protective services. And don't forget also filing a criminal complaint. So, probably at least 5 different actions that you should be undertaking in a case like this, including temporary hold on the account or plus temporary hold. The other case is Mrs. Folsom, a widow, has withdrawn $80,000 from her account for gifts to relatives. You go and visit her, and you find out that she believes that she has won $8 million in lottery winnings. All she has to do is send $80,000 to a Nigerian government official for legal processing fees, and she would get this $8 million. Now, the Nigerian lottery scam is one of the oldest scams out there, and it still goes on because some people fall for it. In fact, I had a retired executive who was 60 years old, full capacity, no problems with his legal capacity at all. He fell for it when some basically they contacted him and said this Nigerian law firm will certify that this money was available and was coming his way. Uh, well, he lost 100,000 on that, and I think he lost more than that. And then he had to go back to work, even though he was retired. Um, so in this case, I'm asking, what should you do as an investment advisor? You're not subject to FINRA rules, but you are subject to all those other rules. So very similar answer. You can actually copy and paste a lot of the prior answer in terms of what you should do, but you're not subject to FINRA, so you don't put that answer in there. The third case study is asking a different question. Mr. Clausen and his wife had been married, and unfortunately she passed away. There's a son named Ken. A neighbor, Susan Young, who was 40 years his junior, befriended him, started cooking meals, running errands. At first, Ken was very happy that the father had company, and then after a while, he found out that his father was giving Susan expensive gifts and large sums of money. And obviously aware of manipulation in this case, uh, and Ken just called you, you review the accounts, and you realize that 40,000 was pulled out in the past 4 months. Only $250,000 was left. You are his brokers. Now, you want to find out why that 40,000 was pulled out. You need to have a reasonable belief. So you need to go down and sit with Mr. Clausen. Imagine the situation in which you believe he's under undue influence from a younger person. Uh, what local what are you going to say to him? That's the first part of the question. How would you phrase what you're going to say to him? And how do you think the conversation might unfold? And then what local resources would you refer to? I'm not asking in this case what state reporting or federal reporting you might be mandated to do, but what local resources might you try to bring to bear? Now, interesting enough, I've had several cases like this. I had a case like this in a nursing home where an aide in a nursing home was basically convincing an elderly patient, a client of mine, to basically give her gifts. And we were able to get her fired, of course. So, should you ever file guardianship for a client who is subject to financial abuse? Should you be the one who files the guardianship petition? And the answer is no. You don't want to put your client through that situation. You want to explore all the alternatives. But beyond that, that's not something that you should really subject yourself to liability for. What your goal is to try to get somebody else to file guardianship if that's the last resort, the only way of protecting this person. There are some alternatives to that. You could refer them to an estate planning attorney. Maybe the estate planning attorney makes their trust, which holds all of their assets, irrevocable. Or if they have a lot of IRA assets, there's something called an IRA trust that can be set up at a bank or with a trust department or trust affiliated trust agency with a brokerage institution. So there are some alternatives to guardianship that could be explored that an attorney might be able to go through in terms of the client losing control, but really voluntarily control. Guardianship uh, tends to be a proceeding that most people don't like to go through. Here's another case, and just to explore it, it's not in the readings, it's not something you answer. We'll call her Mrs. Z. This is a true case that happened here locally. A widow, age 58, was enamored by a gentleman she met on the web. He came to Kentucky for 2 weeks. He was a busy executive in Las Vegas, and during the time he was here, he told Mrs. Z that he was going to gift each of his 30 employees iPads, which were worth $900 each new, when he got the disbursement from his company, which was coming to him but would take a few weeks. Uh, he asked her to loan him 27,000 to purchase the iPads, which she did, and um, despite several visits to her, you basically went out and met with her as her investment advisor. You believed that the man loved her and would repay her the money. And if you report her as the investment advisor to Adult Protective Services, you would likely lose her $2 million account. What should you do? Well, one of the first things you ought to do is see if she consents to let anybody else in the family know. Um, one of the this in this particular case, the investment advisor actually sat down with the client several times and really talked to them. They had a long-standing relationship. Tried to talk her through it. Tried to make her understand that it wasn't love. That she was basically being exploited. She refused to believe this, and eventually she fired the investment advisor, who at that unable to basically prevent her from being further exploited, had to report her to Adult Protective Services and the State Securities Agency as well, and also had to file a SARS report. So a lot of different things that the investment advisor had to do when the financial abuse continued to occur, and the client would just not listen. A sad case. That's the end of this presentation. Have fun with the readings and those 3 questions. Thank you. Bye.